Welcome. I'm Anthony Fleming III, narrator of the WTTW documentary, The Great Chicago Fire, and I'm also an ensemble member with Lookingglass Theatre Company. This evening, we are excited to give you a behind-the-scenes look at our new documentary, which you can watch tomorrow night at 8 p.m. on WTTW or anytime at WTTW.com. And we've also invited a few historians to share their thoughts about the fire of 1871 and why this event is especially relevant in 2020. But first, here's a short preview of the Great Chicago Fire. Coming up.
They're losing everything. Everything that they knew and had was going up in flames.
A disaster that brought Chicago to its knees.
Everybody's on their own, and everybody's helpless.
When they saw how red the sky was, they said that it was Judgment Day.
The city was a landscape of utter devastation.
An immigrant who shouldered the blame.
She was a woman, she was an immigrant, and I think it was so easy to pick somebody like that.
Catherine O'Leary becomes a myth, and the city embraces that myth.
A city determined to rise from the ashes.
Chicago will rise again. There's a sense that this fire can't stop us. We are destined to become even bigger and better of a city than we were before.
The Great Chicago Fire. Next on Chicago Stories.
As a lifelong Chicagoan, I was excited to narrate this documentary. The Great Chicago Fire is a story that is deeply embedded into the fabric of our city. And yet, as with all stories that shape our city, there are a lot of myths and lies we've all been told. Details that over time are just accepted as fact. Certain individuals' stories and brave acts are forgotten with time, and blame is incorrectly laid at the feet of the innocent. This documentary, through historical photos and recreations, interviews with historians and descendants of survivors, sheds light on what actually occurred in our city on those fateful days in 1871. I love how we truly get to see a sense of what life was like back then in Chicago. We see our city's rise, how we deal and overcome tragedy, and how we triumphantly rebuild, bigger and better. A big thank you to our lead supporters of the Great Chicago Fire, the Nagani Foundation and the Granger Foundation. And thank you for the generous support of Joyce and Matt Walsh, Patty and Dan Walsh, Donna Van Eckeren, the CEO and president of Springboard Arts Chicago, Caroline and John Ballantyne, Clifford Law Offices, and Carl Buddick and Company. And thanks to our partners for this event, the Archdiocese of Chicago and Lookingglass Theatre Company. And now to kick off our screening and discussion, I'd like to introduce the executive producer of our documentary, Dan Protess.
Thanks so much, Anthony. It's really been great working with you on this project. And now I'd like to welcome my colleague, Peter Marks, who wrote and produced The Great Chicago Fire. Hey, Peter.
Good to see you.
Also joining us are Liesl Olson, who's the director of the Chicago Studies program at the Newberry Library, and she also appears in our documentary. Hi, Liesl.
Hello.
Welcome.
Thank you.
Julius Jones is also here with us. He's assistant curator at the Chicago History Museum, and as a matter of fact, he's curating an exhibit about the Great Chicago Fire right now. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
And Ellen Skerrett, an historian of Chicago and its neighborhoods with a special focus on Irish America and Irish Chicago. And Ellen also appears in our documentary. Hi, Ellen.
Hi, thank you so much.
And we invite all of you at home to join the discussion as well. If you have any questions, you can actually enter them in the chat function, which you'll see down there at the bottom of your screen. But before we start our conversation, let's take another look at the documentary.
It quickly became clear this was no ordinary fire. Powerful winds drove the blaze 500 feet in the air, whipping up whirling pockets of air known as fire devils. They sucked entire roofs off buildings and flung them hundreds of yards over firemen's heads, spreading the flames.
You could actually feel your lungs on fire. Because what's happening now is, and was really terrifying, is the fire was in the air. It's in the sky right above you. So this looks like the apocalypse. There were flocks of pigeons, for example, in Chicago that were just sucked into the fire.
Catherine O'Leary described a convulsion of wind and sound.
The wind blowed every way. You could not tell one way more than the other way. You would hear the roar of the fire like a cannon. The roar of the fire, you never heard such a thing.
The residents, they're losing everything. Everything that they knew and had was going up in flames. People like the O'Learys were positively petrified.
So Peter, about a year ago, I called you and told you I wanted you to produce a documentary about the Great Chicago Fire, an event for which there are 0 photographs. That obviously wouldn't be an issue if we were doing radio, but how do you make a TV show about an event where there's no photos?
So that's really the $64,000 question. You know, how do you tell this visual story about this disaster that took place in 1871 when there are no pictures of the event? There are plenty of pictures before. There are plenty of pictures after the fire, but none during. So, you know, we discussed how are we going to bring this fire alive for the audience so that the audience feels the heat. And our answer to that was to use recreations and green screen animation. And so we would have our actors in period costume, and they would be running back and forth as if they were running away from the fire, or in some cases toward the fire. And then in what's called the post-production process, our animator would create the city of Chicago behind them and certain buildings and animate them so that they were on fire. And there are several scenes like that that are in the documentary.
Do you have a favorite animation?
I think my favorite animation is Joseph Hudlin, who was the head custodian at the Board of Trade. While everybody was running away from the fire, Hudlin actually ran towards the Board of Trade into the maw of the fire. And he was going there in order to save important documents, valuable documents that would ultimately allow the Board of Trade to get back on its feet. So that's one of the animations. I think that one's the one I like the best. And I think our actor, Charles Gardner, who's the head of the Screen Actors Guild, he definitely lived it. I mean, he was going like this and you could see him kind of getting away from the heat. And I thought it worked really well.
You weren't exposing the actors to actual fire, just to be clear.
To be clear, no, we didn't set anybody on fire. We didn't set any background on fire. It was completely done on green screen, so everybody was safe.
Peter, I want to talk about the woman who was blamed for starting the fire, Catherine O'Leary. What would she have been doing the evening of October 8th, 1871, 149 years ago this very moment?
Well, I think that she would have been getting her children some dinner. I think she had 4 or 5 children. So she would have been preparing that for them, feeding them after a very long day of working. She ran a very successful dairy business. And so getting her children to sleep, to bed, and then she would have gone to bed herself early, probably around 8 o'clock. And then after that, of course, we have the story of her neighbors starting to have a party for someone who had arrived from Ireland, a relative, and a fiddle starts playing and it keeps her up. And then, of course, all hell breaks loose.
All hell, of course, meaning a fire started in her barn. Julius, I want to turn to you. When I was growing up, we always learned that Mrs. O'Leary was responsible for starting the fire, that she was out in her barn milking her cow and that the cow kicked over the lantern. But actually, right after the fire, there was an investigation. What did that investigation find?
Yeah, so the police board and the fire commissioner held a joint, inquiry into the fire, and they determined in short order that Mrs. O'Leary was sound asleep in her bed when the fire started. And so one of the things we try to unpack when we talk about the fire is, how did this story that was almost immediately disproven become the sort of popular conceptualization of the cause of the fire?
Ellen, I want to talk a little bit about why Catherine O'Leary was blamed. She was an Irish Catholic immigrant at a time when there really was a lot of hatred toward immigrants and toward Irish Catholic immigrants in particular in Chicago. Is that right?
The anti-Irish immigrant sentiment was very, very strong in Chicago at the time of the Great Chicago Fire. And the Irish were victims of it. carried a lot of heavy baggage. They came as poor, impoverished immigrants. Catherine O'Leary was illiterate. She couldn't read or write, neither could her husband. And they were seen as bringing down the city, that this was, they were not adding to Chicago's value.
Why? Why were they so hated and feared? Because of course, those of us who grew up in Chicago know of the dailies and an era where where Irish Americans actually ran the city. Obviously was not the case in 1871.
Well, certainly if you read the daily papers, especially the Chicago Tribune, you could see editorials after editorials talking about the Irish, especially their Catholicism, incompatible with American democracy, that the Irish really couldn't be good American citizens. What I think the documentary does so powerfully is to show the world in which Catherine O'Leary lived. And yes, it starts out in her very small frame cottage, but we also see the world that she and her husband and family belonged to, and that was Holy Family Parish, this beautiful church on 12th Street that their nickels and dimes helped to recreate.
Liesl, the reality is that actually once the investigation was done into the causes of the fire, it was found that the city was in a way collectively at fault. Chicagoans had built much of the city out of wood, obviously not a good idea, and didn't enforce building codes. Given everything Ellen just said, Catherine O'Leary was really a convenient scapegoat, wasn't she?
That's right. And that's the big question, is why we need to hang an enormous catastrophe onto Mrs. O'Leary, why we need a scapegoat. And even though, as Julius points out, she was very much cleared of guilt, that there's still this myth that she caused the fire. I think that anti-immigrant energy, as well as probably a strong strain of misogyny, kept the myth alive. And it's one of those myths that seem to be much stronger than facts. There's a great Norman Rockwell painting of Mrs. O'Leary in her barn, milking her cow Daisy. The cow is turning around and actually looking at, you, the viewer. And Mrs. O'Leary is the big joke. Like, we know what she doesn't know. The cow is going to knock over that lantern and start this horrible catastrophe. And so in some ways, the story becomes a kind of accident or joke to explain what is so huge. You can understand an accident. You can't understand a catastrophe that is so enormous.
And what we tried to show in the documentary is that Catherine O'Leary was in fact a successful small business owner. As we heard, she owned a dairy and was really making it in America. Let's see another clip of our documentary now.
Catherine and Patrick O'Leary lived at 137 DeCoven Street. Patrick, a laborer who had enlisted in the Union Army during the Civil War, had spent $500 on the double cottage and barn.
This was the house that my great-great-grandmother lived in. You can kind of get an idea of really how large it was for that time. The O'Learys lived in one section of the house, and then they rented out 2 other sections of the house.
Though Catherine was illiterate, she ran a profitable dairy business, waking up at the crack of dawn to tend her cows and deliver fresh milk. She enrolled 2 sons in Catholic school for the hefty sum of 50 cents a month.
She was accomplishing a lot in her life. I would imagine she'd have a lot of reasons to be very proud of herself.
She was a hardworking immigrant. She had to be, or her family wouldn't have made it. That's what people forget. Make it or don't. This is America, and she made it.
Peter, one of our goals with the documentary was to try to put a human face on the fire. So we told the story through the eyes of 3 Chicagoans. We already heard from one of them, Catherine O'Leary. Who were the other 2?
Well, the other 2, one was William Bross, who was the publisher of the Chicago Tribune. He was part of what was called the Prairie aristocracy. And these are East Coast Protestants who came to Chicago to make their fortunes. Bross was an abolitionist. He lived in a very luxurious mansion along the lakefront. One of our interviewees called him the Prime Minister of Propaganda. He really believed in Chicago and he wanted to see it go. And the day after the fire, he hops on a train and he goes to New York and he meets with financiers there. He's trying to get them to bankroll Chicago so it can rebuild. And while he's in New York, he gives this incredible account to reporters of what it was like to see the fire burning down his city, the Tribune office, and his lakefront mansion. And then the third person we profile is a guy named Joseph Hudlin. Hudlin was a former slave. He'd made his way from Virginia to Chicago, and he's one of about 3,500 African Americans in Chicago in 1871. He became the head custodian at the Board of Trade, and what we talked about a little bit is that he became a hero because instead of while everyone else was running away from the fire, he ran into the fire and saved these valuable documents in the Board of Trade that got it up and running again. His wife, Anna Elizabeth, took in 5 families after the fire, both black and white. It didn't matter to them. And for that, the Chicago Tribune called her an angel of the fire.
So we looked at the fire through the eyes of an immigrant, a black laborer, and a white wealthy business owner. You really, through this lens, start to see Chicago in 1871 as being a pretty divided place along class and race lines.
Well, I mean, we do. The city was very divided. The country was divided. This is 6 years after the Civil War. We talk about how divided this city is today and our country is today, but certainly there were parallels then. And you had this prairie aristocracy that was the ruling class. You had Catherine O'Leary, who was embodying the Irish immigrants who were looked so down upon. You had the African-American population, which was small but mighty. One of our interviewees said that, people didn't know what to make of the African-American community. It was as if they were outliers, outlanders. So those different strands of a city convulsing really come alive, and the fire exposes the cracks and the surface of this city that was seemingly so much on the rise.
Yeah, a disaster exposing social faults. Where have we seen that before?
Yeah, well.
Julius, the way Chicagoans experienced the fire really depended on where they stood on the social and economic ladder that Peter was just talking about. As you curate your new exhibit about the fire for the Chicago History Museum, what are you learning about how regular working class Chicagoans experience the fire?
Well, I mean, it depends a great deal on whether or not you were unfortunate enough to be in the fire's path, right? So for those who were able to sort of escape the destruction of the fire, they sort of could breathe a sigh of relief on some level. However, for those who were had their homes and their livelihoods and all of their possessions destroyed by the fire, they had to begin the process of recovery. And what we found is that in that process, the inequities that Peter alluded to were exacerbated and reinforced in the very way in which the city managed its recovery from the fire, particularly the decision to turn over the recovery and relief efforts to a private charitable organization, the Chicago Relief and Aid Society, and their sort of decision-making apparatus about trying to determine who was a deserving sufferer, and by extension, determining who was an undeserving sufferer and treating them accordingly based upon those distinctions, which unfortunately, mirrored the socioeconomic distinctions in the city.
Yeah, and I want to talk a little bit more about the rebuilding later, but during the fire, you've actually had the opportunity to handle the objects that people took with them as they were fleeing the fire. That's part of what you're doing now as you're curating this exhibit. You found people had to make split-second decisions about what they were going to flee with.
Absolutely. And not only what they were going to flee with, but what they were going to leave behind and how they were going to leave it behind. So you have a family with children, and they may be able to grab a couple of clothes and maybe their favorite toy, but the rest of them have to be left behind. And so we have melted and misshapen and burned toys from children who, in the split-second moment of leaving, had to, leave things behind. We also have things that people buried in the hopes of being able to return to them at a later date. So things like silverware and serviceware and even jewelry. People literally in the split second would bury these things and cover them up with dirt and hay and hope that they would survive the fire and come back to retrieve them. So you really sort of see in that split second moment, people making decisions about what to take, making decisions about what to leave behind, and making decisions with the hope that already looking to that recovery that they know they're going to have to engage in soon thereafter the fire.
And Liesl, wealthy Chicagoans had more options available to them as they were fleeing the fire. Is that right?
Absolutely. I mean, as in 2020, the year 2020, catastrophe is much gentler on the rich. And, you know, in the immediate moment of the fire, many wealthy elite Chicagoans would have had servants to help them gather up their belongings and to put those belongings in wagons and to get out of their homes quickly. And it happened all very quickly. No one thought the fire was going to jump the Chicago River. But it did, and so people had to move very, very quickly. For working class folks, you know, those extra hands or wagons, you know, they just weren't available. And then, of course, the rich had insurance, and so, and they had money in the bank, and they had bonds, and they often had friends with bigger homes away from the flames where they could stay, or they had second homes, right, outside of the city. Or if they were from the Northeast, they could head out to the Northeast and be back with their families. The railroads were still very operable. The lines of tracks didn't burn. So there were ways to get out of the city as well. So in that respect, even though, you know, a fire is very democratic, it burns rich and poor, the aftermath really put a magnifying lens on the disparities between rich and poor.
Ellen, you've been researching the history of Holy Family Parish and St. Ignatius College Prep, both on the near west side, and both of which survived the fire. What was the experience of the fire like for parishioners and students?
Well, what I see from the journals that were kept by the Jesuits and from the religious sisters who lived in the neighborhood and taught school, they opened the doors. So St. Ignatius College was a brand new institution. They opened the doors and for orphans and the homeless. And by one account, the religious of the Sacred Heart were writing back in French to the Mother House in Paris and said the Jesuits served 7,000 to 8,000 homeless. Julius had mentioned the Protestant Relief Society. There was all kinds of Catholic outreach, but it was not acknowledged either in the official record, and we know this from the Catholic records that we have. And it's a missed opportunity, really, because Catholics were responding to very real needs with their own institutions that they had built with their own nickels and dimes, and they were receiving aid from around the country. For instance, the BVM Sisters Mother House was in Dubuque, and barrels of food and provisions were sent to Chicago to aid the homeless.
Peter, the documentary shows people fleeing the fire, but we also see how a lot of people stopped to watch. This was a common phenomenon, wasn't it?
You know, it was. Outside Mrs. O'Leary's home, while the barn is going up in flames, you have a throng of people who gather and they're drinking, and people would look at fires as spectacles, as entertainment. And the people got so rowdy actually outside Mrs. O'Leary's that the firemen actually had to turn their fire hoses on these revelers. And of course, they have no idea that the fire is going to get completely out of control, because at that point, Chicago had seen 20 fires alone in October. And people were used to gathering and seeing these, and the firemen would come along and they'd put them out because they were very good at getting out ahead of the fire. But in this case, they simply couldn't catch up. And the next thing you know, the people who are watching the fire and enjoying the spectacle and drinking, they're running for their lives and their homes are being burned down.
And I want to turn now to the aftermath of the fire and discuss that a little bit more. But first, let's take another look at the Great Chicago Fire, which again, you can watch October 9th at 8 p.m. on WTTW and anytime at WTTW.com.
The fire had burned a path of destruction 4 miles long and almost a mile wide. It had mowed down most everything in its way, creating an open vista from the north side all the way to the south.
The city was a landscape of utter devastation, really total carnage. So much of the city had burned away, had turned into ash and to dust and was gone. So it was this flat and leveled, frightening landscape.
You're seeing rubble in the ground. You're seeing remnants of things that are melted in perverse and weird ways.
And now you don't have a street address. There's no street signs in the city. It's a strange place. People wandered around. They didn't know where they were in the ruins. It's ghost city, you know? There's no landmarks. It's an awful thing.
So there's a certain myth surrounding the rebuilding of Chicago as this kind of phoenix city, which magically rose from the ashes. And certainly the extent to which it rebuilt and rebuilt quickly is remarkable. But part of what I hope to get with this next segment of our discussion are the ways in which the rebuilding was not quite equitable. It favored some Chicagoans over others. And I think there are some important lessons to take away here as Chicago looks to rebuild again from COVID and from years of disinvestment in many Chicago neighborhoods. Julius, let's start with you. A third of the city was destroyed, and the mayor at the time, Roswell B. Mason, decided the city government should not handle the relief efforts. You mentioned this earlier. Instead, he gave the job to a private group.
Yeah, right. And that decision was based on the lack of confidence that some had in government. But some of that lack of confidence is also very complicated. Many people saw electoral politics, particularly in Chicago, as corrupt, but that corruption was based in large measure to their belief that the immigrant populations held too much sway in electoral local politics, right? So they sort of denigrated the aldermen who they thought were too beholden to those Irish, Catholic, and German immigrants throughout the city. So part of the effort of the elite business interests of the city to control the recovery of the city from the fire is their belief that they knew better than the elected officials who were too beholden to the people who they were less than fond of, to put mildly, and that they could not be trusted to do a job free of, corruption and other sorts of, bad government vices.
And the Chicago Relief and Aid Society wants to ensure that no one's worse off than they were before the fire, but they also don't want anyone to become better off as a result of the aid they're receiving.
Absolutely, right? They basically looked at what did you have before the fire, and that is what you're going to get afterwards and no more, right? And so I think it really is sort of a missed opportunity, right? Because their interest was in rebuilding the social order in the status quo because they benefited from it. And I think as we sort of imagine a recovery from, the disasters we are experiencing now, instead of rebuilding our society, we could actually imagine a better and more equitable society and work to build that in the future.
And the concern from the perspective of the Chicago Relief and Aid Society is that people would be essentially taking advantage of their aid. Is that right?
Yes, that was part of it, but also was a very clear interest that Chicago would need to rebuild and that people would need to do their work. And you wanted a pool of available inexpensive labor to rebuild Chicago. So at the very beginning, there was a program which gave people one-way tickets out of Chicago, and they distributed over 100,000 of these tickets. However, they soon realized that, we're sending away all of the helpers, all the work, all the laborers out. So they immediately stopped that program and then tied aid and relief to a work requirement, meaning that if you wanted assistance, you were going to have to work for it. And I think that sort of idea, again, that, your place is common day laborer, much like Patrick O'Leary was, and you have to work and earn your keep because that is your place in society.
And Patrick O'Leary, of course, is Catherine's husband,
Yes.
a Civil War veteran and a laborer.
Mm-hmm.
Liesl, one of the jobs of the Chicago Relief and Aid Society was to house 100,000 homeless people. And that's actually one area where they were pretty successful.
No, that's absolutely right. I mean, it was through the Relief and Aid Society that many, many, many Chicagoans received not just food, but shelter. And by many accounts, the agency did a pretty tremendous job. By mid-November, so, a little over a month after the fire, 5,000 shelter houses had been built for people who lost their homes. But I think Julius's point is very well taken, which is to say, the city's rebuilding was very much in the hands of a private and elite ruling class, rather than, say, the people. And by that, I mean the working class laborers who were going to actually rebuild, physically rebuild. And then there's also, I think, a larger question of, when your city is destroyed, do you try to rebuild it as it was, only bigger and better? Or do you try to reimagine what could be, right? Do you try to actually solve some of the intractable problems that you had in this moment of rebuilding? And I think to a large extent, Chicago wanted to rebuild bigger and better, right? Rather than kind of reimagine or retool.
Certainly, you've studied a lot how Chicago rebuilt itself culturally bigger and better. This is a city that had a bit of a chip on its shoulder as maybe being slightly inferior to New York in the culture department, and they wanted to show that that was not the case.
No, absolutely. And I first started to really research the fire in terms of thinking about that 20-year period, roughly 20-year period between the fire and the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition, better known as the Chicago World's Fair, right? Which was a kind of display to the whole world that Chicago had rebuilt itself bigger and better, and in a more beautiful way with Daniel Burnham's white neoclassical buildings. And then the kind of raucous pleasures of the Midway, which were also there too. I think there was a great deal of cultural anxiety on the part of the city's elite that, we can rebuild our factories and warehouses and our buildings and our infrastructure, but how are we going to rebuild culture? We cannot overlook that has to be part of our focus in rebuilding the city after the fire. There, in many accounts, immediate accounts of what had been lost after the fire. I mean, there are, all these photographs of the city in ruins, a kind of obsession with the ruins of the city, but there were also accounts of the works of art that had been lost, the vast libraries that had been lost, the city's cultural treasures, the Emancipation Proclamation signed by Abraham Lincoln, that it had burned. How do we recover that? That there was a lot of push on the city's elite to do as much to rebuild its city's cultural riches as to rebuild its industrial and commercial networks.
And you mentioned the shelter cottages that the Chicago Relief and Aid Society to house people. This was actually, they would give homeless people a set of plans and a kit of wood to build their own wooden home.
Yeah, absolutely. And so we actually have plans and instructions that we're going to put in our exhibit. But you're exactly right, Dan, that they would sort of give you the wood, give you the nails, and rebuild them, but only if you had owned a home, right? So this idea that, like, again, right, if you're a homeowner, you get to have a home, but if you were a renter, then you don't get to have a home, right? And so I think that those kinds of ideas and approaches, I think really sort of, really undergird that sort of sense of sort of re-establishing a status quo. But they definitely did do a heroic effort housing people and also distributing aid. There is a sort of a case to be made that when you get, the lumber barons and the railroad barons and the, commercial prowess of a Marshall Field and a George Pullman and others, that they have the minds for this logistical undertaking, and that they, as sort of the leaders of this, were really successful in sort of the logistical management of what became a very large endeavor, that is sort of recovering from a disaster.
So Ellen, those are the official relief efforts that were implemented by the Relief and Aid Society. Churches also had their kind of more grassroots efforts, right?
Well, I think the point that the elites missed was that there was culture in Chicago, and in a place like Holy Family, it was just, you couldn't miss it, but apparently it was. I'll give you an example. Long before there was an art institute in Chicago, Father Damon had gotten a copy of Murillo's Holy Family, which hangs today above the main altar. And it was painted by a Belgian Jesuit in 1861, who himself had spent 6 months in London to copy the painting. So there was all kinds of culture, high music. Right before the Great Chicago Fire, the organ from Holy Family was imported from Montreal, Canada. It became the largest organ in the United States. And you look at the musical programs and the cultural activities, Chicago had it, but it wasn't in the places that elites expected or thought it should be. It was in Catholic churches built with the nickels and dimes of poor immigrants. So that's the argument that I'm making, that it was missed and it was underappreciated. And there was strength in immigrant communities. And that too was missed by the rebuilding efforts. I have a question, and I'm wondering how different the relief frame cottages were from the home that the O'Learys owned.
That's a good question. There's one still in the Old Town neighborhood on Menominee. It is I've been inside it. It is very tiny. It's basically one main room with a little room on the back. And I've seen pictures of the O'Leary cottage. It was maybe a little bit bigger than that. And in fact, Ellen, you've said it was actually quite spacious for a family of that station in that time.
Oh, I believe so. I always look at the conditions under which the Irish lived here in Chicago, compare them to Ireland. It was a neighborhood for them. And I don't know that we take our 20th century perspective and look back on 1871 and things look a little different. But the post-fire homes on the north side, would they be condominiums now, $1 million homes? Class does matter.
Mm-hmm. Peter, I want to come back to you. One thing we really pick up on in the documentary is that after the fire, there were all these concerns about social disorder. And in fact, in some cases, the newspapers fabricated reports of looting by the Irish and by African Americans. What's the result of all of these really unfounded fears?
Well, what happens is the ruling class, the prairie aristocracy, they call in General Philip Sheridan and his troops. Sheridan was a Civil War hero. His statue is at Belmont and Lakeshore Drive. And so Sheridan leads troops into Chicago. And as one of our interviewees points out, Chicago becomes the first major city to be occupied by the federal troops after the Civil War. And what are those troops doing there? They're obviously to preserve order, but there's also a symbol of might, saying, hey, you Irish, we're keeping an eye on you. You better not get out of line. And you immigrants, we're here and we're going to hold the line here. So you better keep it to yourselves and not get out of hand. And that's what Sheridan does. It was a delight to the ruling class, including one of our protagonists, William Bross. When he saw the troops come in, he was thrilled to see them.
Imagine that, a politician calling on the National Guard, on troops to enter Chicago to restore order. Where have we heard that?
I can't imagine.
Julius, I want to come back to you. So after the fire, Joseph Medill runs for mayor on the Fireproof Party ticket, and he wins and immediately enacts a law that says that buildings in the center of the city need to be made out of brick or stone. And that law really favors some Chicagoans over others, doesn't it?
Absolutely. You had immigrant communities that had built homes that, as Ellen astutely points out, were very nice homes that were made out of wood, and all of the sudden they felt like they were being scapegoated in the rebuilding, as if sort of their decisions were the ones responsible for the creation of the fire. And so there were bitter battles about these sort of fire codes, particularly in immigrant communities, because they bore the brunt of this disproportional and heavy-handed enforcement, and while simultaneously not having the means to comply with these new building requirements. So it was a great level of political battles in the early 1870s in Chicago about sort of these building codes that really became emblematic of that sort of scapegoating of the other, right? And so, fireproof ticket was also sort of almost a euphemism for some deeper anti-immigrant sentiments slowly just lurking just beneath the surface.
Julius, I want to give you the last word as our city looks to recover again, as we were saying earlier, from COVID and reinvest in our neighborhoods. What lessons do you think we can learn from the rebuilding efforts after the Great Fire?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think the lesson we can learn is sort of what not to do, right? And that is, do not try to rebuild the city as it was. Imagine a more just and equitable city and build Chicago in that image and in that likeness. I think we have a opportunity to really look hard at some deep, entrenched inequalities that exist in our society and really make meaningful progress towards providing redress for them. And I think this moment provides the opportunity to do so, and it's our imperative to take it.
Julius Jones, thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me.
And thank you to Peter Marks, Liesl Olson, and Ellen Skerrett. And now back to Anthony.
Thanks, Dan. And thank all of you for joining us for this screening and discussion. And please tune in to WTTW tomorrow night at 8 p.m. for the world premiere of The Great Chicago Fire. And go to WTTW.com/Chicago Fire to stream the documentary anytime and explore the Companion's website with original content, including video extras that look at 11 buildings that survived the fire and 11 objects that survived the fire. And as always, a big thank you to all of WTTW's members. You make everything we do possible. I'm Anthony Fleming III, and again, please tune in tomorrow night at 8 p.m. Thank you.